Hi, I am Elvira Basevich. I am an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and I'm presenting a paper titled The Shared Experience of Oppression. So, in their recent work, Elizabeth Anderson and Tommie Shelby theorize a pragmatic relation between the shared experience of oppression and the development of political judgment. For them, the shared experience of oppression inclines victims to understand and resist their oppression. Call this the journalistic model. It is journalistic in that it treats group experience and public reasoning as if it were a conduit of empirical information, like a newspaper report about structural inequalities. The journalistic model also views bad experiences as educational. They enhance victims' moral understanding, which in turn prompts their action. The noted Africana philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois favors instead what I call an associational model. An association is a social practice consisting of ongoing interpersonal interaction invoking moral ideals. On this model, intragroup social bonds, especially cultural associations that cultivate such bonds on an ongoing informal basis, help form political judgment and resistance in the aftermath of brutal experiences. I argue that Du Bois's associational model is superior to the dominant journalistic model favored by Anderson and Shelby, and present his defense of the Harlem Renaissance to illustrate a cultural association effectuating victims' moral self-awareness. So, case one of the journalistic model, Anderson's naturalism. Anderson's journalistic model rests on a naturalistic approach to moral inquiry. For her, our natural practical intelligence as a species uses empirical information about our environment to solve recurring problems. Although epistemic diversity is a feature of all reasoners, the oppressed have essential moral insight. The oppressed are best positioned to understand what makes the world imperfect because structural inequalities undermine their lives. By reporting on their living conditions, they communicate, quote, the asymmetric effects of laws and public policies as public information or data. Victims' asymmetrical knowledge refines political judgment given a crucial assumption. She assumes that experience shapes moral self-awareness. It educates the moral perception of victims, who in turn become resolved to report their experiences as public information. There are at least two limitations with this approach, which in my view mischaracterizes the social process of moral learning through which victims come to understand and resist their reality. First, Anderson ignores that victims often struggle to make sense of their own experiences as evincing structural inequality. In contrast, Du Bois was essentially preoccupied with the problem of moral self-alienation. Moral self-alienation rests on the fundamental distinction between having an experience and ascertaining the moral character of that experience. Victims can struggle to understand the moral character of their own experiences, notwithstanding the destructive impact it can have on their lives. They can lose sight of a moral ideal attesting to their self-value and account for why their non-ideal reality contradicts a moral ideal. Du Bois stresses that as a result, victims can struggle to pick out the normatively salient features of their non-ideal reality as being non-ideal. They can thus fail to discern that their experience contradicts moral entitlements. And this failure can be profoundly tragic. Additionally, Du Bois doesn't assume that a commitment to fight is latent in victims, awaiting an external trigger of bad experiences. By treating victims like conduits of information, Anderson overlooks not only that victims can neglect a moral ideal to pick out the normatively salient features of their experiences as bad, but she ignores the distinctive psychological toll of experiencing oppression. She inadvertently ascribes to victims a superhuman resolve to fight. Dubois notes that the daily firsthand experience of oppression can hurt victims' psychological well-being. Notably in Souls, he emphasizes that such experiences can cause victims to sink into self-doubt, despair, and resignation. Emotional damage eventually impacts one's capacity for judgment. Prolonged experience of oppression can make it difficult for victims to believe that they should not have been subject to it in the first place, or to imagine a different world. Now let's take the second case of the journalistic model, Shelby's pragmatic Black nationalism. So his approach favors Black political solidarity, but he too rejects that intragroup social bonds should cultivate political judgment and motivation. Like Anderson, he maintains that experience reliably shapes insight and motivation. It functions as an impetus for collective action that transforms an implicit sense of justice into robust public commitments. Pace Dubois, he downplays that the experience of oppression inflicts a serious moral injury that undermines moral self-awareness. In We Who Are Dark, Shelby grounds victims' moral literacy in Rawls's notion of moral persons. Quote, "The relevant self is simply a moral person, an individual agent capable of developing a sense of justice and a conception of the good," end quote. Rather than appeal to our species' intelligence, for him, the moral person has the implicit moral knowledge that all persons ought to be recognized as free and equal, and they handily apply their moral knowledge to their experiences. They do not suffer moral self-alienation. Rather, they tend to understand why and when an experience contradicts a moral ideal that is built into the evaluative perspective of the concept of moral persons is an understanding of and a commitment to civic equality. Shelby's reliance on the Rawlsian model enables him to assume that the requisite moral knowledge and motivation is already implicit in persons. He then attaches Rawls's idea of moral persons to a Black plural self, a Black we, that he defines as follows. Racial Blackness should be understood in terms of one's vulnerability to anti-Black racism, end quote. Rawls's idea of moral personhood on the one hand, and the shared experience of anti-Black racism on the other hand, are together sufficient for moral progress. However, he is willing to forego racial forms of political solidarity if alternative mechanisms secure the requirements of justice. And yet, he does rely on the notion of a Black plural subject, inasmuch as he posits that exposure to anti-Black racism is a powerful prompt for group action. The direct experience of anti-Black racism is, in essence, the raw material on which victims apply and hone a liberal moral sensibility and act as conduits of information about their non-ideal circumstances. He acknowledges that social solidarity that nurtures communal bonds is valuable in itself, but his account of political solidarity does not require social solidarity. In Shelby's estimation, intergroup social bonds support a vicious cultural nationalism. For my purposes, I detail his objection that Black cultural association afford victims, one, a sense of rootedness, and two, an emancipatory tool to fight. With respect to one, Shelby dismisses Dubois's contention that repeated exposure to oppression is a severe moral injury that damages moral self-awareness. Shelby posits that victims' psychological and emotional distress just doesn't differ from a general dissatisfaction with the modern human condition. At least for the Shelby of We Who Are Dark, no remedy is necessary or politically expedient to redress a problem that, strictly speaking, doesn't exist. Namely, the emotional and psychological damage of enduring oppression. Recall that his Black plural subject is knowledgeable and resilient. Because Rawls's notion of moral persons grounds his critique, he overlooks the function of social bonds in non-ideal circumstances. Intergroup social bonds need not play a role in the social process of moral learning if we assume that political agents are fully formed, morally literate, and resolved to act. So with respect to two, Shelby stresses that the inherent content of culture makes it impossible to fix its content to serve an emancipatory function. It's inherently dynamic. To the extent that distinct cultural patterns develop among the oppressed, Shelby tends to treat them as unfortunate, though permissible, pathologies that indicate the absence of a quality education and basic opportunities among the working poor. So what strategy is best suited for a protracted struggle that includes victims? For him, fighting for justice is ultimately the best means for asserting one's self-respect and building self-esteem in the long run, which should sustain group resolve to keep fighting. But if the oppressed are so demoralized by their circumstances that they neither understand nor resist them, he suggests that those relatively better off, namely Black elites and NGOs, should advocate for the disadvantaged. He repeats this claim in Dark Ghettos, quote, "It falls to private citizens and organizations to convince the politically alienated among the ghetto poor that resistance is not pointless." He thus models Black political solidarity on the shared experience of oppression, only to conclude that those with considerable distance from oppression are best positioned to lead the downtrodden. So I will conclude by presenting Du Bois's alternative associational model. So Du Bois rejects the journalistic model. He disputes that experience imparts moral self-awareness, nor does he assume that requisite moral knowledge and motivation are somehow implicit in our species' practical intelligence or in the part of us manifesting as the Rawlsian moral person. Famously in Souls, he states that, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The color line represents systematic racial exclusion from the basic structure of a modern democracy, as well as denigrating social practices that define a racial hierarchy. In effect, every Black experience of a white-controlled world is a shared experience of oppression, inasmuch as modern democracies are structurally unjust." He's primarily concerned with whether victims recognize this fact about the world and how they should respond to it. that is, which moral ideals they ought to adopt to navigate and dismantle the color line. He takes nothing for granted. He doesn't think that victims will reliably make moral sense of their experiences nor be motivated to resist them. And he dedicates his career to pioneering models of democratic engagement to encourage intergroup moral self-awareness and political solidarity among the oppressed. Rather than take for granted victims' moral self-awareness, Du Bois was centrally preoccupied with the problem of moral self-alienation, in the light of which victims struggle to uphold an ideal that asserts their self-value and motivates collective resistance. He stresses a social process of moral learning through which victims can adopt a moral ideal via intragroup social bonds and find the social support that makes it easier for them to hold on to it in the face of adversity. For this reason, Black cultural associations are important for shaping moral subjectivity in the aftermath of the experience of oppression. They open a discursive space for reflection and should invoke ideals violated by the polity. Du Bois argues that Black cultural associations and any victim-led association under non-ideal conditions should become informal extensions of the public sphere. They ought to function as forums for public reflection about the moral character of the Black experience of the color line. As a result, for him, an art movement or any major cultural movement must assume a political function. Black cultural associations ought to adopt a program of reform that advocates for the moral ideal of Black civic equality and debates its implications in the light of their shared experience. Such a program partly justifies the reason for a cultural association's existence. In his noted essay on art, Criteria of Negro Art, published in The Crisis in 1926, Du Bois famously argues, "All art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists," end quote. Originally given as a speech at the annual conference of the NAACP, in this essay, Du Bois defends the public construction of a shared evaluative outlook scrutinizing the color line. He addresses himself to Black artists, public intellectuals, and the reading public by posing a question. What do we want? What is the thing that we are after? His question shows that his concern is practical. He enjoins Black Americans to adopt a stance redressing their social condition. Du Bois provides a partial answer to his own questions. We want to be full-fledged Americans with all the rights and privileges of other citizens. For him, art is propaganda in that the moral ideal of Black civic equality ought to ground a shared evaluative attitude and guide the formation of intergroup social bonds. His position courted controversy as he spearheaded an oftentimes contentious debate about the politics of the Harlem Renaissance in the pages of The Crisis, the premier magazine of the NAACP. For example, Du Bois develops his theory of art as propaganda in a polemic with Alain Locke, the chief architect of the Harlem Renaissance. While appreciating Du Bois's stress on activism, Locke counters that widespread recognition of the beauty and technical mastery of Black artists indirectly promotes equality. Du Bois retorts that without an explicitly political function, the art movement would dissolve into, quote, decadence, rejecting a search for disembodied beauty that is not a passionate effort to do something tangible, accompanied, illuminated, and made holy by the vision of eternal beauty. Du Bois identifies beauty as a property derived from an artwork's truth and justice. Art is the handmaiden of justice, and its potential for beauty rests in its power to enrich the perspective of its consumers. The apostle of beauty thus becomes the apostle of truth and right that ever bounds their freedom. An artwork that omits a truthful representation and critical scrutiny of the Black experience of the color line cannot be beautiful, however much it has achieved technical mastery and garners praise. Du Bois's theory of art as propaganda goes further still. He argues that the moral ideal of Black civic equality should be propagandized by the principal figures and associations linked to the Harlem Renaissance in direct community engagement. He writes, art requires a real Negro constituency and has to grow out of the inmost heart and frank experiences of Negroes, end quote. His analysis of the Harlem Renaissance is therefore not limited to aesthetic theory. He endorses a political program of reform that rests on a model intragroup social bonds among creators, curators, and consumers of art behind the color line. And he hopes that Black artists and the public alike will stand together in critical scrutiny of their shared experiences, sketching an advocacy role for Black cultural associations that centers the downtrodden rather than the careers and personal advancements of artists. Unsurprisingly, some artists resented Du Bois's directive for them to become civic-minded leaders and viewed his cultural moralism as the dated position of the old vanguard of civil rights activism. Yet after the collapse of the Harlem Renaissance, Du Bois would link the movement's, quote, failure to its aspiration to win the approval of white elites, for whom briefly, as Langston Hughes would later put it, the Negro was in vogue. For Du Bois, it was a missed opportunity to capitalize politically on a major cultural phenomenon. If major cultural associations continue to fail to assume a propagandistic function, he says, it costs society a fatal price. It makes education propaganda for things as they are. Thanks so much.